Good morning, everyone. We're continuing now with the art of supportive leadership, how to work with people. Let's start with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, dear friend Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to feel your living presence within us, that we may walk through this world in constant awareness of your guiding presence. Help us to see the true priorities of life, not the external things we accomplish, but the inner radiance that comes from being in tune with thee. We are your children. Guide us and bless us. Om. Peace. Amen. Today is Monday, and Monday is the day that we talk about money, Money Monday. And that's just to remind you all that the work that we're doing, the mission of the Masters, as I've actually called it, is wonderfully energized by the financial support that you give. You can go through Patreon, which is this wonderful site for connecting people doing creative work with people who have resources to support them. You can go through PayPal. You can go to my website, Asha Joy. It's easy to do. And all of it just makes it so much more fun for me to know that we're all working together in this way. Earlier this year, I established a nonprofit religious corporation called Mission of the Masters, which was the only way I could think to describe how I feel about what I'm doing. It might be slightly overnamed because I don't want to feel that I own that name, because we're all doing the Mission of the Masters. And I filed with the IRS to get tax-exempt status, which I recently was granted. So any of you who might want to make an end-of-year donation for the benefit of your taxes, you can donate to Mission of the Masters, Inc. It's a California religious nonprofit, now tax-exempt. If it's not clear to you how to do that, just contact me, and I can help you with the details. It's very simple. And for me personally, it's a while ago, it became clear to me that what I was doing no longer fit neatly under the umbrella of Ananda Palo Alto, which is the community I live in and help develop. But I was following Swami's instructions to become what he called a global ambassador for Ananda. And even though Ananda Palo Alto continues to support me in a wonderful way, I really needed to define a ministry on my own terms, which is what we've done now. And it's a small thing for people who do that kind of work all the time, but it's a big thing for me. And I feel quite confirmed by your support and by Master's blessing. So thank you, with deep gratitude for the opportunity to serve Master with you. I'm honored. Now, the other thing that happened, which is why some of you might have noticed that we had a false start on this recording. A couple of weeks ago, it would be 2 weeks ago now, my dear friend and soul sister, Seva, left this planet. And it was a big event for all of us, and I did 1 or 2 broadcasts here inspired by my friendship with her. And as a result of that and other things, I've been getting different letters and emails from people who also were close to Seva. She was a very humble person, and the effect she had on people was enormous compared to the profile that she had in the world. And so lots of people have been writing to me about what she means to them. And one of them was a very good friend of mine named John Fox. I can't remember, unfortunately, his middle name, because John Fox is not an uncommon name. He's a man who lived at Ananda Village for a number of years. He also was part of our community here in Palo Alto for a number of years. He's a poet, his primary work, and he actually, I believe he created it himself, something called poetry therapy. So he has worked in VA hospitals and places like that. He has a little tag that says poet therapist, which I just absolutely love the creativity of it. And he's been a friend of mine and a disciple of Master for many years. And he wrote about Seva and how her life has touched his. And he sent me one of his poems, which is about death. It was actually written for his sister who died. And the poem is called Everything is a Surprise. Death might, and I wanted to share the poem with you. It's by John Fox, and it's for Shelley, my sister, he writes. Death might be a moment where being everything you are is met by a welcome surprise, and by a discovery you make that it was, or actually is, perfectly fine to be who you are, is more than all right, and it is only this surprise and your discovery of it that went missing for a while in your life, or was so long, but not entirely forgotten. But when surprise meets you, you discover that it is everything who will open arms wide to you. Pause for just a moment, even step back slightly to await your arrival, to give you a moment to see, and yes, you will run forward full tilt, aware you might as well keep running hard like that, because what else is there to do now? Aware, and even more, feeling assured, you could never knock everything over, and are, at the same moment, about to discover everything will never let you fall. I thought that was so beautiful, I really had to share it with you. So, thank you, John. It's just, poetry is so interesting. I've never written poetry. It's odd that I haven't written poetry, actually, because I'm such a wordsmith. And I'm such an appreciator when people find a way to just use a few words and just take you on one of those little journeys. So even though Seva's death has become the way things are, it's always a mystery. Just the fact that when somebody dies, they're completely gone. My friend, whose husband died quite suddenly a number of years ago, now she's on the other side too. He went out for a run in the morning with a friend and said, I don't feel so well. And he sat down on the curb and died. So there was no prelude. Like Seva, there was just no prelude. And afterwards, his now widow said, every widow I know doesn't like that word. Now the wife that was living on this side, she said, he's not gone, just that communication is a little harder than it used to be. She said, I took it for granted that we could communicate so easily. She said, now it's a little harder. I thought that was a very sweet way to put it. But he was gone. You know, the physical body was never going to move around and come and open its mouth and speak to her. So when I think about Seva, I think of her still living in the place where she always lived. But already, or soon, someone else is going to live in that place. And my father, my mother, all the people who are gone, they're just gone forever. It's, well, it drives people to God. Because if you really think about that unfathomable mystery, a very dear friend of mine, when he was about 6, as a child, I didn't know him as a child, but he said he became exceedingly concerned about death and very, very frightened, actually. His parents kept telling him, you know, you're not going to die for a long time. We're not going to die for a long time. At 6 years old, he tried to explain to them that it had nothing to do with time. It had nothing to do with security. It had to do with the fact that it was inevitable and it would come to everyone. And he later became a very serious devotee because just that fact, having in the middle, and he was so bewildered, even at the age of 6, that everybody was just walking around and just pretending that this complete, impossible, unfathomable mystery did not live right in the middle of everything. And they couldn't console him, and he thought they were completely irresponsible and thoughtless to walk around without an answer to this. And so he became interested in the spiritual path of self-realization extremely young. Young meaning teenage years, just past teenage years, because finally, and as soon as he understood the self-realization path, just boom, the whole fear which had haunted his whole life, it was suddenly, there was an answer. That's certainly what I felt when I met Swamiji. It's like somebody finally is asking and answering the questions that have always seemed to me like they should be answered, except in school no one would talk to me about it. I wasn't worried about death per se. That I wasn't worried about death. I became interested in it at a certain point. But to me the question was suffering and happiness. And people's lack of imagination, my favorite school experience, because it really had to be the most ludicrous thing that happened to me. I was in, I believe, the 5th grade. It could have been the 4th grade. My teacher was teaching us about why there was not life on any other planet. And the reason was that there were these, now bear in mind, I'm in my 70s now, so we were a little earlier in everything then. And why there was no life on other planets, because these were the conditions that would support life, and whatever they were, I don't even remember. Whatever it had to do with oxygen or water or whatever. These are the conditions that would support life. No other planet had those conditions. Therefore, there was no life on any other planets. I raised my hand to ask the question that was just so obvious. Couldn't there be life that was adapted to some other conditions than these conditions? Like, how dumb do you have to be to ask that question? And the teacher said, no. And I'd already long since lost interest in these people. But it was just like, just because we're 9 or 10 doesn't mean you can treat us like morons. What a silly answer. And she didn't have any basis for it at all. That was my schooling. Whenever anyone talks to me about higher education, I say, I'm not the person you should talk to. I wanted wisdom, and I didn't find it. I respect that there might have been more wisdom out there. It wasn't my destiny. But when I met Swami Kriyananda, it was just like, well, I was already rejuvenated by Swami Vivekananda and Ramakrishna, but Swami Kriyananda was the first living person. I mean, I went to East West Bookshop here because I lived right here in this area. I have this strange affinity for this area. It's the only place I've ever lived except Ananda Village. Southern California, but since I've been a grown-up, since 18. But when I met him, he was a living person, American on top of it. And he was asking the questions that I'd always wanted somebody to ask and answer. So I've never looked back. So anyway, I love John's poem because it was such a sweet way to talk about it. What poetry does is you can take some really enormous philosophical concept and just turn it into a little story. And all of a sudden you have the picture of his little or big sister going to the other side and just running free, because you suddenly realize, why not? I can do this. I can run free now. Nothing holds me. So let's give us a few minutes of our topic for today. Oh, one more thing about Money Monday. I am 111 subscribers away from having 10,000 subscribers on YouTube. So if you know 111 people who would like to subscribe to my YouTube channel, now is the moment. Nothing is going to happen when I have 10,000 subscribers, except it'll be fun. The number will change. Okay, let's go. We are in a new chapter on the art of supportive leadership, and this chapter is called Giving Support. It's called Supportive Leadership, and this chapter is called Giving Support. When we needed a title today, I said, Supportive Leadership? How about that? I mean, he's been working his way around to this, but now he's being very, very specific. So, he starts with, the leader who fears strength in his subordinates is concerned merely with protecting his own position. Any work that he and they may be engaged in is certain to produce only negligible results. Indeed, it is likely that such a leader will find himself eventually alone. Here comes Swamiji and he never hesitates to say it, in full and unchallenged command of a sinking ship. So Swami never, never hesitated to tell it like he really saw it. You know, it's a miracle to me at times that we as human beings live at all. There are so many forces that are constantly undermining our sense of security and happiness. This is why, from my very young age, I was really interested in finding happiness. Just understanding why happiness was there or why happiness wasn't there. Because I could feel, and I was born into beautiful circumstances as I've grown older and realized some of the upbringings that some people had who were just dragged up through impossible circumstances, whereas I was treated like a princess from the moment I was born. So I have to start with that, which is so odd because I also, I was just so serious. I was so intensely serious, and I was so determined to really understand things in a deep way, in the ways that were important to me. And I had a very sensitive sense of right and wrong and so on. Not that I always conformed to it within myself because, well, what do you know? We're out of control. In the Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna asks Krishna, why is it that again and again, against our own knowledge that this is a wrong action, we are compelled to do those things which we know will bring us misery? Krishna answers, desire, action, and anger. Desire and anger, there may have been another, but we want, and then we don't get what we want, and we in our frustration, we become angry. And there we go. And we want because the heart is restless, and it believes that if I have this, then this unhappiness inside of me will be eased. Master put it really well. He said quite simply, everything that we do is because we think it will increase our happiness and lessen our suffering. No matter how misguided that thinking may be, it's still in there. I became very angry once. I flare. I don't really feel that I have a temper in the sense that I don't get enraged about things. Every once in a while, when I had to deal with the city of Palo Alto on an issue related to the sign for the church we had just acquired, and this bureaucrat was just in the most cavalier telling me what I could and couldn't do. And when I came out of the office, I actually thought of firebombing the office. And it was a genuine intention on my part. If I had had access to firebombs at that point, I might have firebombed it. I think it was a past life memory. So I could feel it. I could feel that. And on one other occasion, I became enraged in a similar situation, just red hot. Maybe it was the same day, just red hot anger that was almost beyond what I could control. However, I don't, as a rule, have a temper, but I can flare quickly. So I was going to say this in relay. Oh, yes. And I remember once that I really had the thought that if a certain person would just die, everything would be better. It was only just a momentary flash, but it took me down that whole corridor of, oh, I see why people commit murder. I mean, there was nothing in me that was even remotely like that, but if the person could be eliminated from the equation, everything would be so much better. And then I saw that whole road where a person does something that just seems so crazy to everyone else. How would you think that murdering someone would help? But that crosses your mind because everything that we do, we think is going to lessen our suffering and increase our happiness. So Swami starts right here. The leader who fears strength in his subordinates is concerned merely with protecting his own position. Well, there are many people in the world who would say, well, of course you have to protect your own position. I mean, what else would you do? You can't jeopardize your position because where you're standing on the karmic scale, that's just what it looks like. And the process of being the kind of leader that Swami is writing about in this book, and the kind of leader that he was, is when you really begin to understand what brings happiness and what causes suffering. And the delusion that protecting ourselves, that building my position and protecting myself is going to make me stronger rather than giving. I do, for those of you who are Patreon supporters, you know, once a month I do a question and answer session, which appears only on the Patreon. It's an energy exchange for the support that comes through that. And one of the questions that I answered recently was someone, I think the circumstance is that they're married, they're devoted to Ananda, their partner is not devoted to Ananda. The person who wrote to me has a certain understanding of the spiritual life and where happiness comes from. The partner doesn't, so this was the dilemma. And one of the principles of self-realization is selfless service, that when we give without thinking about what we're going to get back, it frees us from that delusion that the way to find happiness is to protect ourselves. And this question that was posed to me is, the partner thinks that you can give away a little bit, but you have to be very judicious about what you give away, and after a certain point, even no matter who you are, you have to be paid for it, and especially if you're offering your professional services, you have to be paid for it. You have to sell what you have. You can't just give it away. I answered the question at length and also just said, but there's no possibility that you're going to persuade your partner that this should be different, because it's a stage of spiritual evolution. The four castes in India, the Shudra, which is characterized as the peasant, the Vaishya, which is the merchant, the Kshatriya, which is the soldier, and the Brahmin, which is the priest. Those are archetypes, not necessarily, not social castes, not social positions. They're progressive. The Shudra feels that the less energy I put out, the better. That happiness comes from sloth, basically, from not having to put out any energy. It's very uncreative. They have to be motivated by threat of punishment. The Vaishya is willing to put out energy, and that's where it comes to the merchant, because the merchant has to sell his wares. He can't give his wares away, but he can offer a fair price, he can offer a good deal, but there always has to be an exchange. It can't just be done on principle, because otherwise the merchant ceases to exist. The Kshatriya begins to understand that I have to act according to principle. And what's in it for me is that when I act according to high principles, that's where my happiness comes from. And one of those high principles is that I am part of a greater reality, and that the happiness of others is my happiness as well. So I'm much more inclined to want to give than I am to worry about selling what I have and making sure that I get something back. And if I don't get something back, I'm not going to do it. Why would I do it? And from the Vaishya point of view, it just makes perfect sense. And you can be a good Vaishya. But what happens is, as you begin to put out energy and as you begin to please people with what you give, the Vaishya gradually learns that the actual pleasure is not what I get back. The pleasure is in giving. And that's where suddenly the principle of generosity begins to sort of, from experience, it begins to insinuate itself into your awareness. I remember a friend of mine who actually was in a position to give away cars was doing so because he had access to automobiles and used automobiles. And I remember him telling me, gee, it just feels so great to give these away. And I was like, yeah, congratulations. You know, he'd gotten the pleasure of being wealthy from doing that work, but all of a sudden he also realized that generosity was more enjoyable than mere self-aggrandizement. So there's the characteristic feature, insofar as I've ever been able to find one, of people who become interested in the path of self-realization. There's two that I've seen. One is the realization that the inner world is the defining reality instead of the external world in terms of my happiness. That my inner world is what gives me happiness, not merely the structure that I've set up around me. And the second thing is that even though there seems to be an edge to what I call myself, in fact, I am part of a greater reality. And this is an interrelated universe. And my actions have my self-definition. The bigger I can define myself, just like this lovely poem is saying, the surprise of being greeted by everything and realizing that I am a part of everything. In Master's Whispers from Eternity, he has wonderful poems in there that include, in several different ways, this very thought. And one of them is very explicit. Help me to get as much joy spending for others as I get from spending for myself. Help me to see that the happiness of others is the same as my happiness, and the sorrow of others is the same as my sorrow, meaning that all of my actions have to be guided by the principle of connectedness to everyone. And so Swami is writing here, those who fear strengthen their subordinates. All they're thinking about is protecting their own position. I don't want other people to get strong because they might prove a threat to me. And Swami says, yeah, if you do that, if you keep everyone around you, make sure that they stay small, he said, you'll never accomplish anything. Because as we'll go through this chapter, you end up completely alone. As Swami puts it, and the ship is sinking. The ability to build a team. That's what I've watched in 50 years of Ananda. The success and failure is based on the ability to build a team. And when you can build a team of people who are just as dynamic as you or more so, that's where real success comes from. So that's what we'll continue to talk about this week. God bless you.